much for joining us today and for braving the weather, for those of you here who are in the room. Um, and a warm welcome to all of you, also our online panelists and the audience. I'm very happy to present the Geneva Health Files Dialogues, our signature series on frank and critical conversations on global health. We take this opportunity to share our newly updated book on the TRIPS waiver negotiations. It has about 70 stories published in Geneva Health Files between July 2020 and till about July 2024. Next slide. So it's been an especially challenging journey in producing the book because I knew nothing at all about book publishing. It has been very frustrating, but I've had help along the way. It came at the request of some negotiators about 2 years ago. So we actually published the first edition in 2022, soon after the conclusion of the June 2022 ministerial. And then we updated it over this summer to include discussions on the extension. And this book is dedicated to my son, Kabir, who is now 6. But when I first started reporting on this stuff, he was about 2 years old. I'm grateful to numerous sources, obviously all unnamed, and friends and experts who really educated me during this process. Some of them are in the room. Thank you for that. I really thank my family, my husband, Adi, and my parents in helping me bring this together. And a quick word of thanks to my team, Julia Dodster, who helped me really figure out how print on demand works. To Nishant Sirohi, Alisa Chetrick, who helped variously in the production of this book and in the reporting process. And also to Bianca, who's here administering the webinar for us, and Gaurav Garg, my colleagues, who helped me pull this together. Special thanks to Toba, who's helping record the session. You should be able to order the book online, and it's print on demand. And if you have trouble, let us know. Next slide. So, as this audience is very well aware that this is the story of how intellectual property trumped global health, how an audacious proposal at the WTO became a global movement during the pandemic, but ultimately met with the biggest and the most stubborn forces in capitalism. It begins in October 2020 when the proposal was brought by South Africa and India and follows the circuitous journey of these discussions. And we close with the TRIPS review currently being considered at the WTO. So just to jog your memory a bit, the book has 9 chapters. I won't go into details, but basically the various stages of these negotiations on the emergence of the proposal between August and October 2020, the stalling of the proposal in early 21, EU's counter-proposal to the TRIPS waiver that was between June and October 21, and the anticlimax when the General Council, the ministerial was basically postponed 48 hours, and it was a General Council decision taken late one evening. And then the emergence of the Quad group, namely the US, the EU, India, and South Africa, and the DG's compromise text between March and June 22, and the final lap towards a limited waiver in June 2022. And then at that point, it was called as the TRIPS waiver 2.0 for therapeutics and diagnostics. And that went on for about nearly 2 years, including the demand for evidence and the US ITC process. And then we conclude the book with the call for a review of the TRIPS agreement led by Colombia, the proposal that came to be considered first in April 2024. I think the idea of, next slide, the idea of doing this event really was, to place these negotiations at the WTO in a wider context and to probe what it can mean for the future, not only for global health, but also perhaps for the access to climate technology, for example. So I think with that, I'll just head to the panel discussion. Next slide. So we have 2 panelists with us here today. Thanks so much for joining us in person. And we have 3 participants, 3 online panelists online, participants online. So first we have, let me quickly introduce, we have Ambassador Guilherme Patriota, who's at the Brazil's mission to the WTO and other economic organizations in Geneva. Nirmalya Syam, Senior Program Officer for Health, IP, and Biodiversity at the South Center. We have James Love, Knowledge Ecology International, joining us from the US. Sangeeta Sashikant, Legal Advisor, Third World Network, joining us from the UK. And we also have Mustaqim Degama, former counselor at the South African mission to the WTO in Geneva, who authored the TRIPS waiver proposal and currently affiliated with Afrigen. He's joining us online from South Africa. So we'll hear from them, and we'll hopefully have time for questions, including from the audience here and those online. We have an hour to go through with this. So I will request panelists to keep the initial interventions to about 5 minutes each. Ambassador, we start off with you, if you don't mind. We can have the mic. So maybe really your initial reflections on, sorry, you good? Yeah, okay. The initial reflections on how do you see the relevance of these negotiations, not only in the past, but also going forward and across forums, including at WIPO and WHO?
Well, thank you, Priti. Thank you for inviting me. I think it's a very auspicious occasion to be honored with the occasion of releasing this new book. It's quite a huge effort you have made, I think, to map out and register the full process of almost 4-year negotiation of a TRIPS waiver at the WTO. So congratulations to you. I know you've been following it through these periodic articles systematically, the whole discussion process, and now you kind of collected them, compressed them into a single book. So I think it's the only reference we have right now to work with and to sort of capture the rise and fall of a very important negotiating process. And I think it's a little bit maybe like a diplomatic pandemic. You know, it goes up and then it goes down a curve. And so I think the negotiating process followed the international health emergency itself, going up and down as the politics of health emergencies go up and down globally. So did the negotiations. And it's, once again, I think it reveals that there is a underlying perception that intellectual property rights have perhaps expanded to a degree where the public interest and private interest balances is no longer easily acceptable by all, especially when you're facing a situation such as an international health emergency of concern that kills people in the numbers that it did with the COVID-19 situation. So, but this is a process that the TRIPS agreement was already born under a perception that developing countries in a way caved in to unbalanced demands coming from northern countries and their very large multinational pharmaceutical companies. It was a sudden change in the regime that before was controlled by WIPO-based treaties, and then all of a sudden it crossed the road, came to the WTO. It came under a new, sort of a brand new, much less flexible and forgiving system of obligations and tied to the WTO's then fully functional dispute settlement system. So there was even an enforcement mechanism that made the rules and the norms much more rigid and imposing upon all members of the global community. So I think what this means is that once the pandemic kicked in and it demonstrated how serious it was and how unprepared countries were and how the global trade system and the production facilities were not prepared to respond with the agility that the pandemic required to save lives. and to keep people minimally protected and healthy. I think, again, the political circumstances were there again that allowed for this proposal by India and South Africa to prosper in a way, because it did prosper and it did lead to serious negotiations that would not have occurred without the pandemics. And we still have some consequences of that, which is the pandemic treaty at the WHO. They're struggling, but it's a process that only exists because of the COVID-19 health emergency. So I think it's important. Of course, once the emergency sort of fades away, then the political pressure and the outcry also fades away. And then there's a tendency to get back to business as usual. And then the very strong forces that support this system, the TRIPS IP system, which are very, very strong, because it's a joint action between large multinational companies of the pharmaceutical sector with their respective governments of these companies. They kind of join hands, and usually they defend the same positions, and they're not at all open to any tweaking of the system to make it a little bit more humane, a bit more democratic, a little bit more working to the interest of the public at large, including large segments of the global population that cannot afford IP-protected medicines, treatments, and diagnostics.
Thank you so much. If I could just follow on with a quick question. You know, the power imbalances continue to exist. Yes, the pandemic has come and gone, but how do you see this sort of evolving going forward, these kind of potential moves towards these kind of potential proposals also in the future?
Well, it goes up and down. I think we are in a down moment right now. The TRIPS Council, for example, is quiet. We didn't manage to meet the deadline to extend the waiver towards therapeutics and diagnostics. The waiver that came out is, to the eyes of demandeurs, extremely superficial and narrow, and not exactly what was envisaged. But that's what was possible to achieve at that time. But now there's a second initiative, which is a review of the TRIPS agreement. Review doesn't mean reopening or rewriting. We are clear on that, but it does mean some sort of critical assessment that based on facts or based on measurable benchmarks as to how the supposedly, the treaty that's meant to protect innovation and the modernization of technology on a perpetual basis, whether it really does that, and to what extent do societies that are less affluent have to pay a high price for that in terms of lack of access or lack of affordability for all that is produced under the system. And also even the innovation side of it is questionable if you really put the hard facts on the table. To the extent that protection exceeds the necessary protection for innovation, then you have an abusive system that in fact slows down innovation because it protects for longer and longer periods of times certain existing technologies that are very profitable for the patent holders. And it holds back the entry into the market of newer and better technologies because they will extend to the maximum degree possible their profits over time if they can.
Thanks. We'll head to Nirmalya Syam at the South Center. Before that, can we just confirm that online panelists are able to hear us well, Toba? The online panelists are able to hear us well. Okay, great. So Nirmalya, what have we learned from the waiver discussions? We understand that, WTO rules do allow for waivers, but it did not clearly work. What can be done differently in the future?
So thank you, thank you, Priti, for organizing this. Yes, the waiver indeed took a long time to negotiate. Just noted that your son grew up 4 years older by the time we came out of this process. I think this is a cause for reflection, actually. That what is supposed to be an emergency measure, a temporary waiver, and is written in the rules, actually took us almost 4 years to have some sort of an agreement on, and which was a compromise leading to a suboptimal outcome. This certainly is not what the waiver rules were meant to address, or this kind of an outcome was certainly not what the makers of the WTO agreements would have envisaged. And if we start from that point of reflection, I think we need to look at what the rules say and how far away in practice we have deviated from the rules. So if you look at the agreement establishing the WTO, where the rules relating to waiver are enshrined, it essentially says that when there is a proposal that is made in relation to a waiver from obligations under a particular covered agreement, the relevant council will discuss the matter, will have to have a first discussion on the matter, and then report the matter back to the General Council or to the ministerial, as the case may be, for a decision. A 90-day period is enshrined. So the question to ask is, why was a 90-day period enshrined in the agreement? It was enshrined in order to reach a conclusion in a defined time frame. What we saw in practice was that we ended up in a cycle of TRIPS Council reports coming back to the General Council saying we need essentially more time to come to an agreement, and it became a negotiating ping pong, right? So this is something that probably needs to be addressed going forward if we are to be better prepared for future pandemics or any other emergency, even in the context of climate, for example. And is there scope for addressing this? I would say that if you look at the outcome from the 12th Ministerial Conference, which has been reaffirmed at Abu Dhabi in paragraph 4, of the Abu Dhabi Declaration, it clearly states that there is an intent, a commitment to look at reforming the functioning of the WTO. So not just TRIPS agreement or TRIPS review as such, generally. And I say this because the waiver rules are enshrined in the Marrakesh Agreement. It's not specifically a rule in relation to the TRIPS agreement. There could be potential to look at it in that light. Also, moving forward into the realm of the TRIPS review itself. And I think there is one of the lessons learned has been that in the context of TRIPS, and also earlier in the context of the Para 6 system, the negotiations that led to the adoption of the Para 6 system following the Doha Declaration. In both the contexts, we've had actually suboptimal outcomes come out. And in relation to one specific article of the TRIPS agreement, Article 31. Para 6 system, it has had only one instance of use, and the company which attempted to use it actually went on the record that it's never going to use it again because of the non-facilitative structure around the rules around it that exist. And we know with the waiver, with the TRIPS decision following the waiver proposal, we've also had no substantial impact on the ground in terms of the outcomes of people who were suffering due to lack of access to vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. So in that context, in order to safeguard ourselves from the vagaries of this arduous, long periods, extended negotiations in the next public health emergency, for example, whenever that might occur, God forbid, we would probably need to look at how better to use the rules within the TRIPS agreement itself in the first place, and perhaps use the TRIPS review exercise in order to get to that point, to come out of it better prepared for the next pandemic. And possibly there could be scope for example, of looking at within the realms of Article 40, which calls for limited exceptions, which allows limited exceptions to be applied, whether waiver type outcomes, without actually negotiating a waiver necessarily, countries implementing waiver type outcomes on their own volition would be consistent with within the contours of an Article 30 exception, limited exception, because it would be limited, time bound in a sense, as long as, for example, a pandemic or a public health emergency lasts, etc. So there could be scope for looking at it in that context, whether in those contexts intellectual property rights could be suspended, application processing could be suspended, or for that matter, whether a peace clause could be proposed in the TRIPS agreement itself in order to have a built-in sort of waiver in public health emergency contexts. Of course, you're all aware that in the pandemic treaty negotiations, there is a proposal that parties should support waivers, regardless of what the outcome is. For example, if you get an outcome that parties should agree in the pandemic treaty that they should support a waiver, you would still have to agree to a waiver in the WTO. So it creates an obligation to support a waiver. And if you look back at the negotiations, no country actually opposed the waiver. Those who were not supportive of the waiver in its full extent, full scope as proposed, did not say we oppose the waiver. They actually wanted to get to a waiver that in their view was most appropriate and balanced. So nobody will be objecting a waiver, everybody will be supporting, but supporting less than others, for example, or more than others. So even if you have that commitment in the pandemic treaty that everybody should support a waiver, you would still have to get to that outcome in the WTO. And therefore you need to sort of build in insurances within the system to get there. Thank you.
Thank you. I think if I'm not mistaken, both the language on waiver and on the peace clause is still bracketed in the current text of the treaty, pandemic treaty. Can we go over to James Love from Knowledge Ecology International?
Hello, thank you. I think it was quite important that Priti was covering this story from start to finish, and she brought a record of the voices of people that were, a diverse set of voices, but she was inclusive in terms of people from developing countries and from health groups that were pushing for more equal access to products during COVID, and was able to go in depth and so we really valued her reporting and publication, and also the publication of the book, which I think for scholars that are looking back or policy wonks that are looking at this, it'll be quite an important record of how things played out. So congratulations on the publication of the book. At the center of the negotiation of the TRIPS waiver was, in the beginning, it was quite broad, but as it sort of ended, it was on this issue of whether or not you restrict exports under a compulsory license to a patent, as well as some provisions on know-how. And it was always been appalling to me that the WTO, an organization set up to liberalize international trade, and anyone that studies trade knows that at the heart of justification of trade is that economies of scale and comparative advantage are critical in economic progress and efficiency. So the WTO has always had this bizarre restriction on the export of products under a compulsory license in the original TRIPS agreement. And this ended up being discussed as paragraph 6 in 2001, a long time ago, in the original Doha Declaration negotiation, when people were really focused on HIV. And there was an attempt to limit the outcome of that negotiation to either HIV or HIV and a handful of other diseases, and that was rejected. It was rejected to make it temporary. It became a permanent. The Doha Declaration was a permanent thing that covered all diseases. There was an effort to limit it to emergencies, and that was also rejected. And then you had this follow-on negotiation and concluded in 2003 with what ended up being the amendment to the TRIPS 31 bis. And that was considered to be really a problematic, complicated, trade restrictive, embarrassing thing for the WTO. During the COVID crisis itself, a Canadian manufacturer of vaccines had an agreement with the Bolivia government to make a generic version of a vaccine and import it into Bolivia. And Bolivia made its notification to the WTO of its intent to use this provision as an importer. But Canada refused to put COVID-19 on its list of public health problems. It was kind of an astonishing decision, actually, that Canada, while they're in the WTO negotiations on the TRIPS waiver, were claiming how great the existing rules were, wouldn't even acknowledge that COVID-19 was a public health problem right in the middle and the worst part of the pandemic. So part of the problem are the rules, and part of the problem are the implementation of the rules or the political pressure that's put to bear on countries to try and use them. The TRIPS review, which I think was what I was asked to speak about today, is you sort of see a lot of the same dynamics in terms of the sort of north-south positions on this. But I want to point out that one of the things that we'd like to see come out in any kind of discussion about where TRIPS stands right now is how the EU and the United States have used exceptions in the TRIPS agreement in ways that are not being used in developing countries for the most part. Beginning with a Supreme Court decision involving an online auction house, the eBay decision, involving patents on online auctions, and the widespread use of the government use provisions in the United States. What I think has become quite obvious is the United States completely ignores any restrictions on exports under a compulsory license. When those exports or when those compulsory licenses are implemented under a different part of the TRIPS, under the part of the TRIPS Part 3 that deals with enforcement. In Article 44 of the TRIPS, the WTO rules in the TRIPS, they allow countries to export even 100% of output without prior negotiation or even notification of patent owners if there's some measure in place to compensate patent owners. And that is what the U.S. did in over 50 contracts that we've obtained during COVID-19, but over probably thousands of contracts over time in terms of government use contracts that authorize the use of patent inventions, even for products that are not even sold in the United States, like treatments, for example, for diseases of which there's no incidence in the United States, and for lots of things that have nothing to do with medical products. And the same thing is true with the so-called eBay compulsory licenses, where a judge can basically grant a compulsory license, even when 100% of the production is outside the United States, which we see in some cases. The EU also, in their new proposed regulation on compulsory license emergencies, proposes not only one compulsory license to cover almost 30 different countries at the same time, but they also explicitly are proposing in the regulation that the compulsory license include not only rights on patents, but it require people, compel countries to share manufacturing know-how, trade secrets, access to reference products, all sorts of things that are unrelated to the patent. And importantly, during COVID, the argument against the use of compulsory license was often that you didn't have the know-how to make the overriding the patent useful. And the EU, in their own regulation, says you can actually compel everything else that you need, anything you need, really. And the Defense Production Act in the United States has the same provisions. The United States allows you to compel anything that's necessary to make a product. So the US and the EU, they have this double standard. They have like one thing that they will do themselves if it's in their interest, and then they want to maintain kind of a narrative in Geneva that these things should never be done. They're not necessary. They won't work. And that's that. You know what you saw in the TRIPS negotiation was that. Now on October 17th of this year, during the WIPO Standing Committee on Patents, we're one of the co-sponsors of a side event where we're going to talk about. The title of it is "The Best and the Worst Patent Exceptions," and that's a topic we'll be discussing there. But I want to come back to the publication of the book. This is a really valuable record of what happened during the negotiation, and it's only available because of the dedication and shrewd reporting that was done by Priti. Thank you very much for allowing me to participate in this book launch.
Thanks a lot, Jamie. So we are slightly running behind time. We'll head to Sangeeta. Sangeeta, can you tell us? I guess we know, but why hasn't there been any uptake of the rules of the decision that was adopted in June 2022? And does the call for a review of the TRIPS agreement inspire any confidence in you?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Priti, for having me on this panel. Let me also begin by congratulating you on the publication and its update. It's a very valuable contribution, as Jamie has mentioned, to capture the negotiations, the movement around negotiations. And it is a very important reference, including for the upcoming discussions on the review of the implementation of the TRIPS agreement. So as I come to the review of the TRIPS agreement, I just want to also give some reflections on the TRIPS waiver discussions, negotiations that took place following the proposal. Just looking back, the steps that was taken by South Africa and India, supported by 63 other developing countries, and also many academics, health agencies. It was a global movement that supported that proposal. That proposal that called for a waiver from the provisions of the TRIPS agreement was extremely important. It was a time of unconscionable inequity. At the peak of the pandemic, we saw supplies in developing countries extremely limited, and even worse in least developed countries. And at that time, UNCTAD actually did a report in October 2020, and it said that the imports of COVID products were 100 times larger in high-income countries, the developed countries, in comparison to low-income countries. So while we would definitely expect that, but I think it was more the sheer difference which was staggering. Now, at the core of it, the proposal was, and I think this is very important as we consider the review, is that at the core of it, it was recognition at the WTO level that countries have the option of freedom to operate by suspending implementation and enforcement of relevant intellectual property provisions for the purpose of containing COVID-19. So when we have intellectual property there, and even to use the flexibilities, there are many procedural administrative delays. Often it takes about 6 months to a year, 2 years to issue a compulsory license, because it covers various ministries. So the idea was really to remove these barriers, facilitate international collaboration, and very importantly, to have economies of scale. So to diversify supply options and expand them, right? That was the whole purpose. And the WTO rules had actually a very firm, had a legal provision that allowed for this, is the waiver of exceptional circumstances, that has already been mentioned. And COVID was definitely an exceptional circumstance. So it was a moment for WTO to show it was relevant to addressing global crises, which it failed to do so, and I'll come to that. So another very important aspect of the TRIPS waiver proposal was it came at a time where we needed a forum to highlight the challenge of inequity, affordable access, and a lot of the hypocrisy we saw, because just before the proposal was submitted in April 2020, all developed countries had promised a global solidarity, equitable access. There was the establishment of Act Accelerative. And a few months later, we saw the exact opposite happen. So the idea was really to bring visibility as well. As we saw it, it was very important in bringing global visibility and awareness of intellectual property monopolies, because as those that were trying to even expand supply options, they were already being, some of them threatened by legal firms, of potential infringements of intellectual property. I think what came out quite clearly is the highly concentrated supply chain that we have in this area, which is unsuitable to address public health needs. And so we need greater freedom to operate for manufacturers to diversify and expand supply options. Now, it took about 20 months to reach a decision. I think what we had by June 2022, of course, it was very limited to vaccines. It was too little and too late, and many of us, I think it has been said before. But interestingly, by June 2022, there was an urgent need for affordable generic therapeutics. So as the decision was being negotiated, it emerged very strongly that we needed therapeutics, to prevent the spread of the COVID-19. And there were already therapeutics entering the market. And until then, all therapeutics were out of the reach of developing countries. And WTO made many different appeals for the decision to extend to therapeutics. And that did not happen. So this was another missed opportunity for WTO. It did not deliver. But what I would say is, while the decision is limited to COVID-19 and vaccine, in terms of its elements, the waiver of Article 31F, it is definitely an improvement in terms of Article 31 bis of TRIPS, which has many different procedures attached to it. And it's unworkable. If you look at the text of Article 31 bis, and you look at the text of what was adopted, you can see that there is a better way of doing it. And we can consider that as an approach to address needs in countries with inadequate manufacturing capacity. Now, looking forward, we have the review of the implementation of the TRIPS agreement. So this is another opportunity for WTO members to undertake assessment of the TRIPS agreement, whether it is sufficiently flexible to address global crises. The COVID-19 was a global health crisis, and we are going to see similar crises in the context of, say, climate change. We already see many public health emergencies in the context of Mpox, and a repeat of inequity that we have seen repeatedly, whether it's Ebola, it's Mpox. So we really have to take an assessment of the TRIPS agreement in the context of all these different global crises. And the review is definitely long overdue. Under Article 71.1, it should have happened after the transitional period ended, I think 2 years after the transitional period. It has not really taken place, so it is long overdue. And I think it is definitely an opportunity to understand the extent of implementation of TRIPS and the different challenges countries face in the implementation of TRIPS. And if you look at the submissions that have been made by proponents of the TRIPS waiver proposal, several of these challenges are actually captured. For instance, political pressure in using compulsory license, the procedures attached to the use of Article 31, and etc. And I think we have now seen, at least in developing countries, almost 2 years or 20 years of full implementation following the transitional period. So we have an opportunity now to unpack the impact of the TRIPS implementation on different levels of development.
Thanks a lot. We'll go over to Mustaqim Tegama, who's joining us from South Africa. Thanks so much for joining us, Mustaqim. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you, Madam Facilitator.
Thanks a lot.
Happy to join.
For joining. It'll be good to, get a sense of your reflections on the process and any advice you might have for negotiators at WHO.
Thank you. Let me join the other speakers in congratulating Geneva Health Files for a really stellar compilation. I think during the process, it's always important to have a complete, at least, record of what is transpiring. And I think in many cases, whether it's in the WTO or otherwise, you don't find that complete record. And certainly the waiver stands out as a beacon because from the start, I think the proponents were adamant that this was not going to be a discussion that would be held within the confines of an organization. We had made the decision that this discussion would be globalized because of the touching points to human rights, for example. And I think, as Sangeeta indicated, the sheer number of organizations that supported this particular effort was quite inspirational. To my mind, it was also the first time that many of the interlinkages between intellectual property and all of the other public policy areas actually coalesces and is presented as an integrated picture. And so from that perspective, I've also heard that the initial proposal was very wide. Yes, of course, it was wide. Why was it wide? Because at that time, when we brought the proposal, we didn't really know which countermeasures, which medical countermeasures would be effective. There was talk about effective vaccines, but at that time, we didn't have much information. And so in order to ensure that we had the type of physical separation and access, we had a much broader waiver proposal. So I think that's one aspect. And over time, as explained, this narrowed to the most essential aspects. And so from that perspective, we were always of the opinion that the waiver should be fit for purpose, should be time-bound, and should be effective in terms of implementation. As Normalia also pointed out, this took quite a long time, and as your son may also testify, this took much longer than it should have. And at the end of the day, it does point to some internal requirements that we have to agree to. When we did bring the proposal, it was a waiver proposal under Article 9. And of course, with all the discussion, it took so long that by the time that we had reached some sort of outcome, the pandemic had already seen almost its end stages. But what are the practical implications for all of us, and how do we take these lessons into account? I think firstly, as many of the speakers already indicated, it's a good basis for us to try to assess how the TRIPS agreement is working, and review of the TRIPS agreement probably would be foremost. There's many case studies that apply in this regard, and I think WTO members should affirmatively agree to actually do this. A second point that's important is that from a global public health architecture, what has happened with the international health regulations and now with the pandemic treaty, it's very important to try to embed and take these lessons forward. One of the aspects that is often overlooked in the ministerial outcome is the reassurance on Article 39.3 on so-called know-how, for example, that shouldn't be a barrier. And I think in my current position, I do see quite a lot of barriers in terms of access to know-how, but also, as some other speakers indicated, the kind of concentration of supply capacities. And if we should have another pandemic, I believe that a regionalization and a transfer of capacity to various parts of the world will essentially ensure that we have a much more fit for purpose platform and the ability to address these. And so from that perspective, I believe that it's important to have discussions about what happens during pandemics, but ultimately what happens between these pandemics is even more important, and the agreement on rules that are easy to implement and easy to understand would override any political, technical, or legal arguments. Let me stop here, Madam Facilitator. I'm sure that there would be many, many more questions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Has these negotiation given any positive impact as far as the access to health is concerned too, where it is not of immediate concern to the larger question of access?
And is that to a particular panelist?
Open to all panelists, please.
Okay, so do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, myself, Srinath Nambudri, currently a student at Graduate Institute here.
Any other questions at this point? Yeah.
Thank you. So if I understood your question correctly, has there anything happened in the interim? I assume that would be interim before the waiver, because we've just come out of the decision and we are moving into the post-decision era, as it were, and are now trying to reflect on the lessons learned, right? As we mentioned, and Jamie also mentioned this, I mean, prior to the TRIPS decision, following the proposal for the waiver, what we had was the Doha Declaration. The Doha Declaration was also adopted in the context of the HIV/AIDS crisis, as you know better than myself. And one of the solutions coming out of the Doha Declaration was the Para-6 system, Article 31 bis, which again had very limited uptake in terms of actual impact on the ground, including in the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. One country signaled its intent to use it, and there was no case in point of actual use of the 31 bis system either. And that sort of contextualizes why there was need for a waiver at that point of time, right? I mean, you have 31 bis, which is unusable in a sense, and there are chilling effects, for example, for use of other flexibilities. You have the special 301 listing of countries periodically happening. In the interim, these are the things that have also happened. I mean, you have the reference to the UN high-level panel's report, which talks about a lot of these issues, which has had a chilling effect on the use of flexibilities as such. And when we came to the pandemic, the response to the demand for, one of the responses to the demand for a waiver was, well, you have the flexibilities, use of flexibilities, those are sufficient. So yeah, I mean, essentially in the interim, we really had a lot of chilling effect being imposed through external factors on the use of flexibilities. And we did not see anything inside the WTO that was geared to address these. There was no discussion. I mean, for years, for example, in the TRIPS Council, the demand for a review of the 31 bis mechanism, how did the Para-6 system work, has been sidelined to a side discussion outside the TRIPS Council itself. So we have not had a deep discussion inside the TRIPS Council itself. Thank you.
I had one question also. You had a question? Ambassador, I wanted to understand this something that I think Nirmalia mentioned before, which is that even if WHO member states agree on using flexibilities, of the of the TRIPS agreement in a pandemic treaty, but ultimately a lot of the decisions will have to be taken at the WTO during the pandemic. What's the way out of this? How do countries move forward at the WTO in the context of a health emergency? Will we be faced again with long drawn out negotiations?
Yes, most probably. Yeah, I think the organizations are, there's no like automatic, I think, cross effect or effect across the organizations if you adopt the pandemic treaty, even if you claim that in light of declared international emergency declared by the WHO Director General, it would trigger some sort of flexibilities or a suspension of certain IP related obligations for members to deal with the emergencies. This would only have effect, in my understanding. I think we have people here who are capable of answering this question from WTO itself, but it would have to be sort of, the decision would have to be incorporated into the body of rights and obligations of the WTO. So it's not enough. The same, we just ended a treaty at WIPO on a disclosure of origin requirement. And so it's adherence to the treaty, and once the treaty enters into force, we'll have to comply with that obligation and adopt it in its national legislation. Now, is it automatically recognized by TRIPS? No, you have to sort of raise it within the WTO, and you require the acceptance of members, a consensus within WTO, to cross-reference that and to sort of recognize it within the WTO system. So the different organizations, they are not connected legally in any automatic way. So it makes things even more difficult. I think we have a sort of trilateral coordination amongst the secretariats, WIPO, WHO, and WTO. They meet often, they have these seminars, but it's not a legally consequential kind of coordination. They cannot change that order of things. So the organizations and the obligations, they're shielded. They don't communicate with each other. But nevertheless, I think the pandemic treaty would be incredibly important if it were to adopt some sort of an agreement to support a waiver. Of course, that would be half, politically, it would be meaningful, but then we do have to do something, take it up within WTO later on.
Right. We have one question at the back, please. Apart from the waiver, there are lots of other references to sustainable production also in the pandemic treaty. So those are also important in that sense.
Hi, I'm Erica Watanabe. No, I'm Erica Watanabe from the Brazilian mission to the WTO. In light of much of what is said here by the panelists, in light of the reality and the history of TRIPS negotiations, the difficulty surrounding 31bis, negotiations around 31bis, the difficulties around the negotiations of the waiver, the pandemic waiver. What is the panelists what are the panelists' expectations towards the revision of Article 31? How do you expect negotiators and the membership to deliver differently of what has been seen in the last 30 years? And considering that the negotiating environment is much harder, I would say, than before. Thank you.
You want to take the question? Are the panelists still online? Yes. Yeah, Sangeeta. Okay.
Yeah, I will pass to the panelists online. Just a moment.
Oh, it's okay if Ambassador Patriota wants to take the floor.
Yes. Okay. You can talk, Sangeeta.
Okay, all right. I just very quickly, I think the approach, so the decision that came out on 17 June, I think, has got good elements for how to approach supply to countries with export to countries with inadequate manufacturing capacities. I think in terms of procedures, elements, it is more feasible if you were to take the approach. Of course, that decision currently is limited to COVID-19. So if you look at 31 bis, one of the challenges, I'm pointing out just one, is that the exporting member, will issue a CL and only amount necessary in the importing countries will be manufactured and everything has to be exported. So actually, it's very impractical because, a manufacturer will not have the sufficient economies of scale if the demand is small. And a manufacturer will be, if it's a proper manufacturer, will be exporting for multiple, to supply multiple places, to achieve economies of scale. So if you look at in terms of practicalities of implementation of 31 bis, you'll find that it falls short of what is really required. It's not very practical to operationalize it from a manufacturer's perspective. And that is why it's not really workable. So I think if you look at the 17 June decision, there are elements, that are better. I would say it's easier, a little bit more flexible in terms of notification, and it doesn't have this type of conditions. And even the condition on, having measures to ensure there's no products that are sent are not are not diverted to other countries. There is also a footnote for humanitarian purposes, which does not exist for. So, of course, if there's political will, this is feasible. But yes, the forum, the discussions are quite difficult in the WTO, and I think Ambassador Patriota would be best placed to maybe address that part. Thank you.
Let me quickly go over to Mustaqim as well.
Yes.
Yes, I think in terms of the preview of the TRIPS, we have to understand that it's an agreement that's been crafted, and there's quite a lot of history behind it. Now, of course, COVID-19 showcased a lot of the practical difficulties, and so if I were to say, well, if we limited this review to the TRIPS agreement, where would it leave us? Well, to a certain extent, I'm also compelled to look at other parts of the Marrakesh Agreement, especially those that relate to trade-related investment measures, for example, because ultimately what we want is that countries are able to take up autonomous manufacturing capacity, build the supply chain networks, and so forth. And as a result, I believe that the TRIPS agreement, read with all of the other exceptions, should endeavor to actually deliver not necessarily on the physical words, but the spirit behind these words. And so from that perspective, I recall, for example, in Article 31, bis subparagraph 3, there is an exception for regional supply, but that exception is crafted so narrowly that it requires 50% of that regional body to be composed of LDCs. And to my mind, there's only one regional body in the world that complies to that. And so these are the obvious points that have to be interrogated. And I believe, as Sangeeta also said, the further clarification given by the ministers also broadens this particular landscape. So instead of focusing narrowly only on what IP does, focus also how IP interacts with other disciplines and how these collectively may be bottlenecks, including, trade restrictive measures where you have supply of reagents, for example, and so forth. Thanks.
Ambassador, do you want to respond to that?
Well, I think the review brings another opportunity to focus on all these questions in a broader manner. It's not just COVID related, it's not related to the particular case of the pandemic. So we can have a broad look at trips 30 years later and try to see if we can move in the direction of having a more evidence-based support, let's say, or discussions regarding the real impact of trips today. I think the COVID experience showcased the shortcomings in a lot of the system. It wasn't IP only, the shortcomings, but IP also played a role. There are a lot of IP related issues around here, a lot of infrastructure issues, a lot of supply chain issues, and even national decisions at certain points. Countries that could have helped had to face export prohibitions, for example, because it became their nationals first and then others. And that happened in a lot of cases. This is not a TRIPS related sort of decision, but it's a decision that is very impactful when there are people dying in large numbers elsewhere and really require access to those vaccines and therapeutics. So I think this is a lot, if we do deal with it appropriately and we get a little bit of goodwill from all members, I think we could make this something interesting out of it. It doesn't have a mandate to negotiate the waiver, but I think it can also lead to a very consequential and significant discussion. And also to see how we can better integrate these trade-related obligations with health-related commitments as well. The international health regulations of the WHO is the closest thing to a covered agreement in the WTO because it's mandatory. So it's quite serious. There's a lot of things that are triggered and countries will have to comply once an international emergency is recognized and declared. So amongst these things, perhaps even suspension of IP rights could be included in there in the realm of those special provisions, because I think at that moment, clearly human health should come first, first and above all other considerations of trade or industrial commercial profits.
Priti, we have James wants to talk as well. Yeah.
Okay. It's fine for us in the room, but I think online participants will have to. Jamie, go ahead.
Thank you very much. If you did a review at the TRIPS Council on the use of compulsory licensing, it would be weird to me if a lot more attention wasn't given to the massive imbalance of the number of compulsory licenses issued in the United States compared to all the other countries on the planet. I mean, the U.S. Issues compulsory license at the court level in injunction proceedings on a regular basis, and they do it for a wide variety of industries. And the beneficiaries have been like Microsoft, Toyota, all sorts of big companies. Thank you.
All right. So I think we'll have to wrap up, but Nirmala, you wanted to come in on.
So just to put point again, this could be perhaps, I think it's Article 6. There is reference to the national deference principle. Now, what's interesting is at the time when the Uruguay round negotiations were concluded, the agreements were adopted, there was an understanding that there would be consideration given to the possible extension of the national deference principle to other WTO agreements. Nobody picked it up thereafter, but this was a sense that was at that point of time, that consideration would be given to extension of the national deference principle. Now, if you are to have the national deference principle applied to TRIPS, perhaps we would be in a position where we would have some sort of trigger in hand or switch in hand to act in the context of public health emergencies. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I think we will probably wrap up here and continue the conversations, if you don't mind, in the room, and we'll let our online panelists go. It's pretty early for Jamie as well. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we are happy to continuing this conversation. We are right around the corner here in Geneva, so we will, continue to have these discussions. Thanks for joining, everyone. Also online, our panelists, really grateful for your time. Thank you.